The Xinthian research vessel moved slowly through the empty darkness of space, where nothing was supposed to exist anymore. Commander Vexler stood at his station watching the sensor readings with confusion spreading through his mind, because something impossible was happening right in front of his eyes. The human homeworld called Earth had been destroyed 300 years ago, and every record in the Galactic Council archives confirmed that humanity was extinct and gone forever from the universe. The war had been quick and brutal and final. Humanity had refused to bow down to the Council's authority, so the Council had made the decision to remove them completely from existence. Every human world had been targeted, and every human ship had been hunted down, and every trace of their civilization had been erased from the galaxy. That was what the official report said, and that was what every species in the Council believed without question. But now Vexillar was looking at something that should not be possible. His sensors had detected a signal broadcasting from deep space in this abandoned sector, and when his science officer Krellick had analyzed the frequency, he had gone very quiet and very still. The signal was a distress beacon, and it was broadcasting on old Terran frequencies that only humans had ever used. No other species in the entire galaxy had ever replicated those specific wavelengths, because they were unique to human technology and human engineering. Vexler ordered his crew to run the diagnostics 3 more times because he could not believe what he was seeing. Each time the results came back exactly the same. The beacon was real, and it was authentic, and it was definitely human in origin. Krellick brought up the historical records and compared the signal pattern to the archived data from before the purge, and everything matched perfectly. There was no possibility of error and no chance of mistaken identity. The commander felt something cold moving through his body as he gave the order to investigate the source of the beacon. His ship changed course and moved toward the coordinates, and within 2 hours they found what they were looking for. A space station hung in orbit around a dead star that gave off barely any light at all. The station was old and battered and covered in scars from 3 centuries of floating alone in the void. Micrometeors had pitted the hull and cosmic radiation had darkened the metal, but the basic structure was still intact and still recognizable. The design was human without any doubt. Humans had always built their stations and ships with sharp angles and aggressive lines that looked ready for war even when they were meant for peace. This station had the same design philosophy and the same threatening appearance that had made other species nervous when humanity first joined the galactic community. As Vexlar's ship approached closer, the beacon suddenly changed its pattern and began broadcasting a new message that had been locked away and waiting for someone to come close enough to receive it. The voice that came through the speakers was human and male, and it spoke in the old Terran language that the translation computers quickly converted into something Vexlar could understand. The man identified himself as Captain Johnny Pierce of the Terran Defense Force, and his voice was calm and steady and absolutely certain of every word he spoke. Pierce said that if anyone was hearing this message, then they needed to know that humans were still out there somewhere in the galaxy. He said that humanity remembered everything that had been done to them and everyone who had done it. He said that the Council had made a terrible mistake when they tried to wipe out the human race. The recording was 300 years old according to the timestamp, but it sounded like it had been made yesterday. Pierce's voice carried a promise and a warning and a threat all wrapped together in simple words that made Vexillar's exoskeleton feel too tight around his body. The commander knew immediately that this discovery had to be reported to the Galactic Council at their headquarters on Nexus Prime. This was not something that a simple research vessel commander could handle alone, but something in Pierce's voice made Vexlar hesitate before sending the message. The human had sounded so sure and so confident and so completely unafraid, even though his entire species was about to be destroyed. What kind of beings could face extinction with that kind of calm certainty? What kind of species could plan for their own death and still sound like they had already won? Vexlar ordered a boarding party to enter the station and search for any additional information or evidence. His security team moved carefully through the dark corridors with their weapons ready and their sensors scanning for any signs of danger. The station had no power and no life support and no gravity, but the human construction had held up remarkably well, despite 3 centuries of abandonment. They found living quarters and command centers and storage bays all empty and stripped of anything valuable. But in the central computer core they found something that made everyone stop moving. The data storage systems were still functional and still protected by security measures that took Krellick 6 hours to bypass. When he finally cracked the encryption and accessed the files, everyone gathered around to see what the humans had left behind. There were recordings and logs and reports spanning decades before Earth's destruction, plans and coordinates and technical specifications for things that Vexillar did not understand, maps showing locations scattered across the outer rim territories where no one ever went because the space was too dangerous or too empty or too far from anything important. But most disturbing of all were the personal messages that hundreds of humans had recorded, knowing that they would never see them played. Men and women, and even children, had left words for whoever found the station someday. They talked about their lives and their families and their hope that someone somewhere would remember that humanity had existed and had tried to do good things despite all their flaws. But mixed in with the sad goodbyes were other messages from military personnel and government officials and scientists who spoke with the same calm certainty that Captain Pierce had shown. They all said the same basic thing in different ways. Humanity had known the end was coming, and humanity had prepared for it, and humanity was not finished yet. The Council thought they had won, but they had actually just made their biggest mistake. You cannot kill an idea, and you cannot destroy a species that refuses to die. High Arbiter Thelmoris called an emergency session of the Galactic Council within hours of receiving Commander Vexillar's report from the Outer Rim. Representatives from 47 different species gathered in the massive council chamber on Nexus Prime, which was the political center of galactic civilization and the seat of power for all the elder races. The chamber was built to impress and intimidate, with walls that stretched up higher than most buildings and holographic displays that could show information from anywhere in known space. Today, the central display showed the human space station that Vexillar had discovered, and every representative in the room was staring at it with varying degrees of concern and confusion. Vexillar stood at the speaker's podium in the center of the chamber, surrounded by the tiered seating where the council members sat in their designated sections. He was nervous because he had never addressed the full council before, and because the information he was presenting went against everything the council had believed for 3 centuries. His voice echoed through the chamber as he explained how his research vessel had detected the beacon and tracked it to the station, and found the recordings that the humans had left behind. Ambassador Quixara of the Helion Collective was the first to speak after Vexillar finished his initial report. The Helions were one of the oldest and most powerful species in the council, and they had been among the loudest voices calling for humanity's destruction 300 years ago. Quixara stood up from her seat, and her multiple eyes focused on Vexillar with obvious displeasure. She declared that what he was saying was impossible, because the council had been thorough and systematic in eliminating every human presence in the galaxy. Every planet and every colony and every ship had been accounted for and destroyed. The council had genetic databases and population records and surveillance data that proved beyond any doubt that humanity was extinct. Vexillar had expected this reaction, and he had prepared his response carefully. During the journey back to Nexus Prime, he activated another section of his presentation and brought up the data that his team had recovered from the station's computer core. The holographic display filled with star charts and coordinate lists and technical documents that showed a network of stations spread across the Outer Rim territories. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. The stations formed a communication network that had been monitoring council space for the entire 300 years since Earth's destruction. The chamber erupted with agitated sounds as representatives from different species began talking all at once. Some were angry and some were afraid, and some were simply confused about what this all meant. Thelmoris raised 4 of his primary appendages in the traditional gesture for silence, and gradually the noise died down. The High Arbiter had been in his position for over a century, and he knew how to command respect and attention from the fractious council members. Looked at Vexillar and told him to show them the rest of the evidence. The commander nodded and activated the most disturbing file that his team had recovered. A human face appeared in the holographic display, larger than life and dominating the entire chamber. The woman was middle-aged, with gray streaks in her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of stress and exhaustion. She wore a military uniform with insignia that identified her as an admiral in the Terran Defense Force. The recording quality was not perfect, and there was some interference in the audio, but her words came through clearly enough. She identified herself as Admiral Kate Morrison, and she spoke directly to whoever would eventually find this recording. Her voice was steady and strong despite the obvious circumstances under which the message had been made. She said that by the time anyone found this message, Earth would be gone, and most of humanity would be dead and scattered across the stars. But she wanted the Council to know that humans had seen this coming, and humans had prepared for it. Morrison said that the Council had not won anything by destroying Earth. They had only succeeded in making humanity into something worse than they had been before. She explained that humans did not simply die when you killed them. Humans adapted and evolved and survived against impossible odds, because that was what they had always done throughout their entire history. Morrison said that the Council had taken away humanity's home and humanity's innocence and humanity's mercy. What remained after that was something focused and determined and completely without the restraints that civilized society normally imposed. She promised that humanity would remember every crime and every murder and every betrayal. She promised that there would be a reckoning someday. The recording ended and the chamber fell into absolute silence. No one spoke and no one moved, and the only sound was the quiet hum of the environmental systems, keeping the air breathable for the many different species present. Vexler watched the Council members and saw the same emotion on every face regardless of their species or their anatomy. They were afraid. A junior representative from the Krell Dominion asked when the recording had been made. Vexlar checked his data and confirmed that the timestamp showed it had been created 2 days before Earth's final destruction. Morrison had known exactly what was coming, and she had made this recording as her last act before leading humanity's defense fleet into the battle that everyone knew they could not. Winthal Morris felt something he had not experienced. In many decades of political service, real genuine fear was moving through his body and making his thoughts race in uncomfortable directions. Humans had been dangerous when they were alive and fighting openly. Humans had been unpredictable and violent and capable of incredible feats when properly motivated, but humans who had 300 years to plan in secret, while everyone thought they were dead. Humans who had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. That was something entirely different and entirely more terrifying. The High Arbiter made his decision quickly because that was what leaders had to do in crisis situations. He declared that the Council needed to locate every single human listening post and base and station that might still exist out there in the darkness. They needed to find out how many humans had actually survived and where they were hiding and what they were planning. Most importantly, they needed to find them before those ghost humans decided to act on whatever plans they had been making for the past 300 years. Lieutenant Jake Harris had been searching for human ghost stations for 5 years, and the work was slowly driving him toward obsession. The Galactic Council had created special task forces after Vexlar's initial discovery, and they had recruited the best trackers and scouts and analysts from across known space to hunt down every trace of humanity's hidden network. Harris had joined Vexlar's team as chief of security, and together they had become the most successful hunting pair in the entire operation. They had found 17 stations so far scattered across the outer rim and beyond into regions that most species considered too dangerous or too worthless to explore. Each station they found followed the same basic pattern. The humans had abandoned them decades or even centuries ago and stripped them of anything useful or valuable. But they always left the recordings behind. Always the messages and the promises and the warnings. It was like humanity wanted to be found eventually, but only after they were ready for it. Harris had listened to hundreds of those recordings and read thousands of personal logs, and he was starting to understand how his ancestors had thought and planned. The stations were not random despite how they appeared at first glance. Harris spent his off-duty hours studying the locations and plotting them on star charts and looking for patterns that others had missed. After 3 years of this obsessive analysis, he finally saw what the humans had been doing. The stations formed a trail like breadcrumbs in an old Earth fairy tale. Each location pointed toward the next in a subtle way that only became obvious once you understood the logic behind it. He brought his theory to Vexlar late one night when both of them were alone in the ship's command center. Harris spread out his star charts across the main display and traced the connections between the 17 stations they had found. He showed how each station's position relative to the others created directional vectors that all pointed toward a specific region of space. The pattern was elegant and simple once you knew what to look for. The humans had been leading the Council on a chase toward a specific destination. Vexlar studied the charts for a long time without speaking. He traced the same lines that Harris had drawn and verified the calculations and ran probability analyses through the ship's computers. Everything confirmed what Harris was suggesting. The stations formed arrows pointing toward a region that the Council had designated as completely uninhabitable. The area was called the Void, and it was a zone of unstable stars and dangerous gravitational anomalies that made navigation nearly impossible and survival even less likely. The commander expressed his doubt about anyone being able to live in such a hostile environment. The Void was known for destroying ships that ventured too close, and the gravitational chaos made establishing any permanent presence completely impractical. Several species had tried to explore the region over the centuries, and all of them had either turned back or disappeared entirely. It was considered one of the most dangerous places in the galaxy, and most spacefaring civilizations simply marked it as off-limits on their navigation charts. But Harris smiled when Vexillar voiced these concerns. He reminded the commander that humans had always thrived in impossible situations throughout their history. Earth itself had been a dangerous world compared to most inhabited planets with violent weather and tectonic instability and countless natural threats. Humans had evolved to survive in harsh conditions and to adapt to environments that would kill other species. If any civilization could make a home in the Void, it would be humanity. Vexillar considered this argument and found himself agreeing despite his better judgment. He submitted Harris's findings to the Council and requested permission to investigate the Void. The approval came back within 2 days, along with orders to proceed with extreme caution and to report immediately if they found anything significant. The Council was clearly taking the threat seriously now that the pattern had been revealed. The journey into the Void took 3 days of careful navigation, with their pilot fighting against gravitational currents that tried to pull their ship off course constantly. The sensors were almost useless in the chaos of conflicting gravity wells and radiation storms and spatial distortions that made accurate readings impossible. Harris spent those 3 days running calculations and rechecking their position, and hoping that his theory was correct, because if it was wrong, they were risking their lives for nothing. On the 3rd day, something appeared on their long-range scanners. The reading was faint and intermittent, but it was definitely artificial in origin. Vexillar ordered the ship to move closer while maintaining maximum defensive readiness, because they had no idea what they were about to encounter. The sensor readings grew stronger as they advanced, and the image on their displays became clearer and more detailed. What they saw made every member of the crew stop and stare in complete shock. There was a fleet floating in the heart of the Void, protected from the worst of the gravitational chaos by some kind of shielding technology that the Council's scientists had never developed. But this was not a small group of survivors hiding in the darkness and hoping to avoid detection. This was a full military fleet with hundreds of ships arranged in defensive formations that covered cubic kilometers of space. The ships were human in design, but they were not the same vessels that the Council had destroyed 3 centuries ago. These were new and advanced and built with technology that looked decades or even centuries ahead of anything the Council currently possessed. The hulls were sleeker and the weapons were more sophisticated, and the power readings suggested engine systems that could outperform anything in the Council's navy. Harris felt his heart racing as he stared at the display. This was his people, somehow still alive and still strong, and clearly not finished with their plans for the galaxy. Vexillar was making distressed sounds as he processed what they were seeing, because the implications were terrifying. Humanity had not just survived. They had thrived and grown and become more dangerous than they had ever been before. The sensor operator called out a warning. Multiple ships from the human fleet were breaking formation and moving to intercept their vessel. The approach vectors were aggressive but not immediately hostile. They were being surrounded and escorted and probably scanned with every sensor the humans possessed. A communication request came through on standard frequencies, and Vexillar accepted it after taking a moment to compose himself. A human face appeared on the main screen. The man was young and fit, with calm eyes that assessed Vexillar and Harris with obvious intelligence. He wore a uniform that was similar to the old Terran Defense Force style, but updated with new insignia and rank markers. He smiled slightly as he spoke, and his voice was friendly and welcoming in a way that somehow made him more threatening rather than less. He introduced himself as Commander Peter Blake, and he said that his people had been expecting visitors eventually. He welcomed them to New Terra and invited them to dock with the flagship for a proper conversation. It was not really a request despite the polite phrasing. The human ships had them completely surrounded and their weapons were powered up and ready. The human flagship was massive beyond anything Vexillar had expected. The vessel dwarfed every ship in the Galactic Council's armada, and it was clearly designed as both a warship and a mobile city capable of supporting thousands of people for extended periods. Commander Blake met them at the docking bay with an honor guard of human soldiers, who stood at attention with weapons held ready, but not aimed. The message was clear enough. The humans were being polite, but they were also prepared for anything. Blake led them through corridors that stretched on seemingly forever and were filled with activity as humans went about their duties with practiced efficiency. Vexler tried to count how many people he saw, but gave up after reaching several hundred without getting anywhere near a final total. There were men and women of all ages, including children, which suggested this was not just a military force but an actual, functioning society living here in the void. The commander noticed Vexler's confusion and smiled in that way humans did when they found something amusing. He explained that the flagship was home to nearly 10,000 people, and it was only one of many such vessels in the fleet. Vexler felt his mind struggling to process the numbers because the math did not make sense. The Council's records showed that humanity's total population had been completely accounted for during the Purge. Every human on every world and every station had been documented and eliminated. Where had these thousands of people come from? Blake took them to an observation deck that offered a clear view of the fleet and the surrounding space. Through the viewport they could see not just warships, but also civilian vessels and cargo transports and agricultural platforms and construction yards where new ships were being built. This was not a hidden remnant surviving in secret. This was a full civilization that had been growing and developing for 300 years while the Council believed humanity was extinct. Vexler finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind since they arrived. How was any of this possible when the Council had been so thorough in their extermination efforts? Blake's smile faded and his expression became harder and colder. He explained that the Council had made a fundamental mistake in their understanding of humanity. They had assumed that humans kept all their population and resources in known locations where they could be easily found and destroyed. But humans had never been that foolish or that trusting. When humanity first made contact with the Galactic Council, they had studied the history of galactic politics, and they had seen the patterns that repeated across different species and different eras. The strong always crushed the weak eventually. The established powers always eliminated new competitors who threatened their control. It was a universal truth that applied across cultures and across time, so humanity had prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Blake explained that Earth and its known colonies had only ever held about 70% of humanity's total population. The remaining 30% had been sent out on secret colony missions to places the Council did not know about and would never think to look. They had gone to dangerous regions like the Void where other species refused to venture. They had hidden in asteroid fields and nebulas and around unstable stars. They had built stations in deep space between solar systems where there was nothing worth claiming. These hidden colonies had been completely off the books with no official records and no communication with Earth, except through carefully controlled channels that could not be traced. When the Council attacked humanity's known worlds, they got the majority of the human race, but not all of it. 30% of 30 billion people was still 9 billion survivors. 9 billion people with plenty of genetic diversity and technological knowledge and burning motivation to ensure their species continued. Harris listened to all this and felt a strange mixture of pride and horror. His ancestors had sacrificed the majority of their species to protect the minority who could carry on. Earth had died to save humanity's future. Blake confirmed this when Harris asked directly about it. The people on Earth had known they were bait, drawing the Council's attention, while the real survival plan unfolded in secret. Locations across the galaxy, Vexillar asked why humanity had hidden for 300 years if they had the numbers and the technology to fight back. Blake's expression suggested this was exactly the right question to ask. He explained that revenge was meaningless if you were not strong enough to make it permanent. Humanity could have struck back immediately after Earth's destruction, but they would have lost again because the Council was simply too large and too powerful. So instead they had waited and watched and learned. For 3 centuries humans had monitored Council communications and studied council technology and observed council politics. They had seen every weakness and every crime and every secret that the elder races thought was hidden. They had used that time to develop new weapons and new ships and new strategies. Most importantly, they had used that time to ensure they would never be vulnerable to extinction again. The fleet in the void was impressive, but it was not humanity's only stronghold. There were other hidden colonies scattered across the galaxy in dozens of different locations that the Council would never find. A new voice interrupted the conversation, and everyone turned to see who had entered the observation deck. Vexillar's breath caught in his respiratory system because he recognized the woman immediately from the recordings. Admiral Kate Morrison walked toward them, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body had been enhanced and extended well beyond natural human lifespan. She should have been dead decades ago, but medical technology had kept her alive and apparently healthy enough to still serve in a military capacity. Morrison greeted them politely and asked, "Blake for a status update." The younger officer reported that more council ships had been detected at the edge of the void, but they were maintaining their distance and not attempting to approach. Morrison nodded, and then turned her full attention to Vexillar and Harris. She studied them both for a long moment before speaking. She told them that humanity was not planning to attack the Galactic Council with military force. That would be wasteful and inefficient and ultimately pointless because you cannot change a corrupt system by simply destroying it. Instead, humanity was going to dismantle the Council's authority by exposing every lie and every crime and every dark secret that the elder races had committed over thousands of years. For 300 years, humans had been collecting evidence and documentation and recordings of Council activities. They had infiltrated communication networks and hacked secure databases and recruited informants from species who were unhappy with Council rule. They had built a complete picture of how the galactic government actually operated behind its public facade of justice and order. Now they were going to share all that information with every species in the galaxy. Simultaneously, Morrison explained that the Council maintained control through manipulation and propaganda and selective enforcement of laws that protected the powerful while oppressing the weak. Once everyone saw the truth about how the system actually worked, the Council's authority would collapse on its own. There would be chaos initially, but eventually a new order would emerge. One that humanity would help shape to ensure it was fair and just for all species, including humans. She looked directly at Vexillar and her smile was cold. She told him that the Council had wanted to make humanity extinct to eliminate a threat to their control. Congratulations were in order because they had succeeded in making humans into something far more dangerous. They had created ghosts with nothing left to lose and 3 centuries of patient planning. The transmission went out across every frequency that existed in known space. Human hackers had spent 300 years studying galactic communication systems and learning every security protocol and every encryption method that the Council used to protect their networks. Now they used all that knowledge to break through every firewall and override every security measure simultaneously. Within seconds of activation, the human message was broadcasting on every screen and every communication device in Council space, regardless of whether the owners wanted to receive it or not. Admiral Morrison's face appeared everywhere at once. On Nexus Prime in the Council chamber where High Arbiter Thel Morris was meeting with his senior advisors. On merchant vessels traveling between trade worlds. On military ships patrolling the borders. On personal communication devices in homes across hundreds of planets. Every being with access to any form of electronic communication saw the same image of the human admiral looking directly at them with calm determination. She spoke in clear, simple language that the translation computers easily converted into thousands of different languages for the diverse species across the galaxy. Morrison identified herself and explained that she represented the human race which had been declared extinct 3 centuries ago. She told everyone that humanity had survived and had been watching in silence for all these years. Today that silence was ending permanently. What followed was an overwhelming flood of information released all at once. Documents and recordings and financial records and military reports spanning thousands of years of Council history. Evidence of crimes that the elder races had committed against younger species who refused to submit to Council authority. Records of genocides that had been covered up and blamed on natural disasters or internal conflicts. Proof of resource theft from weaker civilizations who could not defend themselves. documentation of slave labor systems disguised as rehabilitation programs and penal colonies. The evidence was thorough and detailed, and impossible to deny, because it came from the Council's own secure archives. Humans had apparently infiltrated the deepest levels of Council record-keeping and copied everything they found. Financial transactions showing how Council members enriched themselves by exploiting member species. Communication logs revealing plots to overthrow governments that did not cooperate with Council directives. Military orders authorizing attacks on civilian populations who dared to resist. Morrison narrated portions of the document dump and highlighted specific examples that were particularly damning. She showed how the Helion Collective had orchestrated the extinction of 3 separate species over the past 2,000 years because those species had developed technologies that threatened Helion economic dominance. She revealed that the Krell Dominion maintained secret prison facilities where political dissidents were tortured and experimented on. She exposed how Thalmoris himself had personally ordered assassinations of reformist politicians who wanted to change Council policies. On Nexus Prime, the reaction was immediate and chaotic. Thalmoris watched his carefully constructed political order begin to crumble in real time. His communication systems were flooded with messages from member species demanding explanations and accountability. Several ambassadors walked out of the Council chamber in protest. Security forces struggled to maintain order as riots broke out in the streets. Outside the government complex, the chaos spread across the galaxy within hours as billions of beings processed what they were learning about their government. Species that had trusted the Council for generations suddenly questioned everything they had been told. Worlds that had accepted Council authority as natural and inevitable began discussing independence. Military units refused orders from commanders they no longer trusted. The entire structure of galactic civilization shook as its foundation of lies was exposed. But Morrison was not finished yet. In her final broadcast, she addressed the question that everyone was thinking. Humanity could seek revenge for what had been done to them. They had the evidence and the moral authority and probably the military power to make the Council pay for their crimes. But Morrison said that revenge was not the goal and never had been. She explained that humans had learned something important during their 3 centuries of observation. The galaxy needed order and structure to function properly. Without some form of central authority, there would be endless wars and conflicts and suffering. But that order had to be built on justice rather than oppression. It had to treat all species as equals rather than dividing them into rulers and subjects. It had to be transparent rather than secretive. So humanity was proposing a new system to replace the collapsed Council. Every species would get equal representation regardless of their size or power or age. Every voice would be heard in the decision-making process. Every law would apply to everyone, including the enforcers. And if any species or government did not like this new arrangement, they would have to deal with humanity, who would make sure the rules applied fairly to all. Morrison was very clear that humans were not asking to rule the galaxy. They did not want to be the new Council lording over everyone else. But they would serve as enforcers, making sure that no species ever did to another species what the Council had done to humanity. They would be the ones who investigated crimes and held the powerful accountable and protected the weak from exploitation. Lieutenant Harris stood beside Commander Blake on the flagship, watching the galaxy react to Morrison's broadcasts. He asked whether Blake really believed this new system would work. He wondered whether other species would accept human authority after everything that had happened. Blake shook his head and explained that acceptance was not really the issue. He said that other species would not accept human authority in the traditional sense, but they would accept human enforcement because they would not have any choice. There was an important difference between ruling and enforcing. Rulers made the laws for their own benefit. Enforcers made sure the laws applied to everyone equally, including themselves. Harris asked what would happen if the Council or anyone else tried to destroy humanity again. Blake smiled and gestured at the massive fleet surrounding them. He pointed out that humans had spent 300 years preparing for exactly that possibility. They had learned to survive anywhere and build anywhere and fight anywhere. The Council had tried to make them extinct and failed. Now humanity was spread across the galaxy in dozens of hidden locations that no enemy would ever find all of. He explained that the Council had actually done humanity a favor in a twisted way. By trying to exterminate the human race, they had forced humans to become something more resilient and more dangerous, and more unified than they ever had been before. Earth had been destroyed, but humanity had survived and evolved into something that could never be destroyed by any conventional means. Vexlar stood nearby listening to this conversation and finally understanding the full scope of what had happened. The Galactic Council had not just failed to destroy humanity. They had given humans a purpose and a unity and a reason to become stronger. Humans had spent 3 centuries preparing for this moment, when they would return and reshape galactic civilization according to their own principles. Morrison's final words echoed through every communication system in the galaxy. She reminded everyone that humans remembered what had been done to them. They remembered the 30 billion dead on Earth and the colonies. They remembered the children and civilians who had been killed for no crime except being human. They remembered every species that had participated in the genocide and every government that had approved it. But rather than seeking revenge, humanity was offering something better. A chance to build a new civilization based on real justice instead of convenient lies, a system where no species would have to fear extinction for refusing to submit, an order enforced by beings who understood what it meant to be on the receiving end of oppression. The ghosts of humanity had returned after 300 years. They had not come back to haunt the galaxy with violence and destruction. They had come back to own it and reshape it, and ensure that what happened to them would never happen to anyone else. The elder races had tried to erase humanity from existence. Instead, they had created the very force that would end their corrupt rule forever.